Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Stream Dialogue. I'm your host, Dane. This is the third episode, episode number 3 of Let's Reason. This is a weekly episode that we plan to do to discuss various topics, reason about it. Um, Today's topic is why the destabilization of African countries, and why imperialism as it is, neocolonialism, the neocolonial states are using terrorism to destabilize a lot of African states. So, first and foremost, thank you guys for coming. So, the question is why the destabilization of African countries around this time? We see in Congo, well, that ever since that country got independence and the overthrow of Patrice Lumumba, its first, Pan-African revolutionary leader, the country have been unstable. Let's put it mildly, unstable ever since. Different coup d'etat, different, it's just been conflict over and over. As we move further north, we go to countries like Central African Republic. We're still in Central Africa. We go to, Burundi to the east, who was destabilized. Rwanda, we know about the tragedy in Rwanda. Now we're in the Sahel, which a lot of us have given a lot of attention to in the Sahel. Not just Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, but we have Sudan. Sudan was first cut in two with North Sudan, South Sudan, and then we have Sudan itself now has been basically destabilized. It has been in a conflict for almost 2 years now. Ethiopia, which is part of the Sahel as well, part of the Sahel. A lot of people don't know that the Sahel runs all the way to Somalia. I think even Eritrea is part of the Sahel. Ethiopia was in a conflict. So the question is why all these conflicts in Africa? The the point of the support of these mercenaries, terrorists, whatever, and these so-called civil wars in the continent is to keep Africa in a state of conflict, of course, but the end goal is to balkanize these countries. You saw Sudan; it was successfully split North Sudan, South Sudan, and yes, there was a lot of internal stuff that made it easier. This identity crisis that a lot of that we all know that a lot of people face in that region. You know, the so-called, well, maybe not even racism, because these people claim to be of another race, and the race that they claim to be don't accept them. They might speak a language. These people are defining their race based on the language they speak. It's ironic, but still, we move over to Mali, Burkina Faso. So with the destabilization of Libya and the move into the Sahel, the Sahel, with a lot of mercenaries who decide to cut Mali. They're claiming the northern territory of Mali. In some case, they are claiming actually two-thirds of Mali, which is ironic. And these people who claim to represent a certain group of people are not even the people they are claiming to represent are not even a majority in the area they are claiming to represent. But still, Mali was going to be divided into two, maybe more. Burkina Faso, Niger were being there. So the question is why? The whole point is to balkanize Africa. So during the colonialism, kingdoms were chopped up into, these territories. States didn't exist, and then neocolonialism came through now when, the freedom fighting movement were being intensified, not just throughout Africa but throughout the world. But Europe, the West itself, realized that classic colonialism could not reign anymore. So they decided to give us flag independence, cut up these countries into little states: Togo, Ghana, Benin, Burkina, Upper Volta, Sudan. As if a lot of people didn't know, we had French, French, French Sudan, French West Sudan, which consists, I think, part of Mauritania, if not Mauritania, Senegal, and Mali. Again, they wanted to the leaders at the time, African leaders, the revolutionary, wanted to make that into a federal, like a federal state, as what we see in being built in the Sahel. And of course, we know the puppets in Senegal. Senegal removed, then Mauritania removed, and so forth. But still, um, that is why imperialism are supporting African. Well, they're supporting terrorism within African country. Not just terrorism, but civil conflicts, tribal conflicts, and so forth. But the whole point of that is to get access, cheap access to these resources that these African countries possesses. So when we spoke about a previous episode, we spoke about the mercantile system which the European powers adapted during their colonial reign. Well, their first, push invasion in Africa, which is a system that allows European country empires to export more than they imported. And we spoke about different laws or acts being enacted by the British to which limited importation into Britain, but even more so limit im- importation into the colonies that the territories that Britain controlled. So when we talk about classic colonialism, um, colonialism was never just based on racism. Racism is an alibi, of course. It is used as an excuse. You need to explain why we are subjugating these people. Colonialism is basically replacing the things that makes me me. So replacing the things that makes a group of people, that group of people, their identity, and trying to replace it with something other than. And here goes the most important part. So during the conquest of Africa, the imperialists, of course, they send their so-called explorers. So these were people who were traveling throughout Africa. Some were doing trade, some were just traveling around, collecting, like what you would call now today's term, collecting data. Then they will write back home to their people in Europe, let's say the monarchy in Spain, the monarchy in Portugal, the monarchy in Britain, and of course, sharing data on these kingdoms and so forth. And then after that comes the missionaries. Of course, the missionaries and other you would call them cultural, or in the West, maybe cultural or religious leader. They will come in having debates about different stuff about African, African way of life, trying to convince us to abandon or to adapt, maybe not abandon right away, but to adapt their way of life and so forth. And then come the mercenaries. I was listening to Joshua Maponga, and he made a good point of this, that everybody within during the colonial times worked together. So first come the so-called explorers. They will write about these great explorers who discover uh, Victoria Lake. They discovered this, they discovered that, which is all nonsense. How can you discover something that people have been living in for hundreds of thousands of years, which doesn't make any sense? But either way, then come the mercenaries. When we talk about colonialism and the slave trade in Africa and so forth, and how this great kingdom became just disappear overnight, it is as if it is the same thing that is happening today. Of course, they're not using their own mercenary, at least in mass. They're not flooding Africa, as that what we see in the Sahel is not necessarily people from these imperialist states that are doing it. They're using their proxy. They're using proxies, I would say. But that's how many African kingdoms collapse. The same way these mercenary would collapse, the same Mali. The Malian state, or maybe back in the day, the Benin Kingdom could not, what's the word I'm looking for? Could not resist under the pressure of this subversion of the kingdom and state. And then the religious strife, the cultural conflict, the ethnic conflict that these people come around and stir up, start causing. It's like causing a civil war in your into it. Let's in your country today. There's conflict between ethnic groups. When that happens, the central authority, the state collapse gets weaker. Then it's easier for these mercenaries to come in. They can exploit these differences we have with people between people who have been living together for thousands of years. And of course, whatever king state, whatever, people will always have conflict. And this is the thing that us African have to realize when we talk about African unity. Conflict will always be there. It's just human nature. Conflict will always be there. But for our survival, we have to come together and work through these differences. But still, the after the mercenaries come in, your state collapse, then you bring in institution, and those institutions can take whatever, these religious institution, whatever. You can bring in different, you know state that is not state institution that is not indigenous or tailored to the need of the people that lives there. It's just there to divide, weaken these people. So therefore, and if we talk about institution, we can look at the setting up of trade in slaves, in human beings, trade in human beings. So if you look at the dungeon, the trade, the slave dungeons in West Africa, in Ghana, in Senegal, in Nigeria, there are many, because the state, as we will call it today, or the kingdom collapse. There's no central authority. Different people, of course, will look just like me and you, just like different people who actually know the land, will then partake in those things. And because civil conflicts were pushed to divide, people start fighting against each other, and then that thing become basically an institution to trade, human beings, to train their fellow people, fellow brothers that they and sisters that they themselves that used to live together for years, centuries. So when we talk about the mercantile system trying to come back, if you look around the world now, there's a lot of talk. There's a lot of tariffs. There are a lot of tariffs being imposed. Talking about trade deal, re we're trying to balance our trade deficit. So the balance of trade. So many countries are trying to these big countries, they're in economic problems, of course. They're buying more, way more than they themselves are selling. So that's why you see a lot of we need to make more trade deals. We need to impose tariff. We need to bring back manufacturing in order to import less and to export more. So this international economic system is definitely coming back from way back during the European empires. Even though many of those empires have disappeared, we talk about France, its control of African territories, but France also expands still in the Caribbean, and this is where we have to give a shout out to our brothers and sisters in places like French Guyana, French Guadeloupe, and so forth, who are seeking their independence. But fellow Africans, this whole point of reason is to look at this thing as colonialism, and new it, it's not new, but it's way of trying to hold on to what it's got, to hold on to Africa through the balkanization. And if we remember the Berlin Conference, that's a part of balkanization where kingdoms, everything was cut up and given to different European empires. What is happening today is the same playbook they used 400, 500 years ago with their first arrival, or would say invasion of the continent. Mercenaries today, you see them in the Sahel, you see them in DRC, you see them all over the continent. These so-called explorers, they're coming back as NGOs, non-governmental organization. And most of the time, these NGOs are collecting the data. They're underground collecting data on what is happening in the country, in the countries. And a lot of times, these NGOs, as we saw with the conflict in Rwanda, a lot of them can egg on the conflict in the so it's basically the same thing. Basically the same thing. These the missionaries now are replaced by Western officials who come tell us what to do. You need to accept democracy. You need to do, accept this thing that has been suggested to you by some international organization. But even the UN, these are the missionaries who will come and debate your local values. Democracy is better than whatever you're thinking about, and so forth. And if we talk about institution, a lot of the institutions are such as, let's say, ECOWAS. ECOWAS would have been established. These are institutions that are meant to keep the colonial system in place. Visa regimes and so forth. These are things to help keep the colonial system in place. And during the time of colonization, yes, we spoke about the main thing they were there to do was to extract. First, it was human beings. Then it switched to, of course, they were always extracting human beings, just in different form. First, it was through slavery, slave trade. Then it's through more migration and so forth. But they were always extracting minerals, raw materials. So I'll give you a good example: cotton. A lot of African countries export cotton to European countries. Those high grade cotton, first grade cotton. That cotton is then used to make clothes, where it is then worn The, it is then worn. Then the leftover second-hand clothes that are used by people in these Western countries. Maybe somebody gained weight, they've gotten too fat. There's somebody died in the clothes. Somebody died. Maybe a elderly person died. Somebody died in a car crash. The family donate the clothes to something, and then those clothes are then sold back to African country, not just African country, in the Caribbean. A lot of us get second-hand clothes, and it is not sell for cheap. It is sold for exorbitant prices. And then a lot of us, oh, we love certain brand, we love certain things, and it is the part of colonialism that we spoke about, replacing the things that make you with the things that will benefit the conqueror, the colonizer financially. So African garments, African way of dressing is not desirable. It is uncivilized. It is backward. So now the shirt I'm in, instead of wearing my kaftan or something made with cotton from Burkina, made with cotton from Benin, made with cotton from Mali, with African design, I would rather wear this shirt or wear something else because it is suitable. It is not. 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 African clothes is not desirable. The alcohol we drink, we consume. When they came to Africa, they banned or they outlawed a lot of local alcohol production. Then the alcohol that is produced in well, it is produced in the Caribbean through sugar cane and so forth, taken to raw sugar cane is taken to Europe, processed into alcohol, then sold back to the colonies in Africa. You see how crazy this is, how crazy colonization is. Colonization is basically all about economics. And when we look at that, we talk about the racism stuff. Racism is basically a excuse. Yes, we will enslave these people. They are not really human. We're just gonna we're gonna enslave them. They will produce cheap labor. Why? Well, you wouldn't do that to a human being, would you? Mm, they're not really human. They want what they call it, three fourths of a human being, or whatever excuse. They're not civilized. Whatever excuse they use. But at the end of the day, it is the economic side of it we have to look at. Today in Africa, most of the products we consume comes from the same multinational who participated in slavery. Most of the multinational that control mining in our country, that control our exports of raw material, that control the pricing of our raw materials, are the same multinational that were there during colonization. The gold in Ghana, the gold in Burkina, until recently, the gold in Mali and so forth. These were the same multinational that was there even when the slave trade were happening. So therefore, when we talk about this new, plague of destabilization of African countries, it is not just it is not just on the surface that Africans don't like, African countries like to fight. It is being supported by these obscurantist forces. So going forward, as because it is happening as as Africans start to push to overthrow this neo-colonial system. Because what is happening is in the Sahel It has caused, even in southern Africa, you can see that a lot of the borders are being collapsed between Zimbabwe, Zambia, I think Namibia, and so Botswana. You see, these are the effects of African, design freedom, design freedom. You have the free movement of people, and we hope in ECOWAS, well, not ECOWAS, but push the organization away. But in West Africa, Central Africa, these things can happen. But ladies and gentlemen, that is less reason. Um, colonialism is colonialism is imperialism. They both work together. One thing about colonization, it has inhibit our reasoning ability. Many people might learn to read, many people might learn to speak certain languages, but if you can't reason, if you can't see the pattern of events, if you can analyze the pattern of events, if you can understand history, if you can't understand how the past affect the future, we as a people, anybody as a people, you are doomed to fail. So therefore, we believe that we're in the new liberation struggle, not just throughout Africa, but throughout the world. People are resisting this new colonial stage, which is that Kwame Nkrumah described as the last stage of imperialism, which is the most dangerous stage of his imperialism. You see the way it is manifesting itself very violently throughout the world, throughout Africa itself. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. This is Less Reason. Join the conversation. You can meet us on YouTube. Thank you so much.